when 81-year-old retired postal worker Leonard Mendel opened the front door of his home in Golders Green in March 2005, it was to find his wife of 50 years, frail 84-year-old Anne, lying injured in the hallway. She had received 14 stab wounds and later succumbed to her injuries. DNA profiling of traces found on Mrs. Mendel led the police to Kemi Adeola, a former neighbor of the Mendels. Adeola, a prolific shoplifter and the daughter of a millionaire estate agent, had recently served time in Bulwood Hall Young Offenders Institute, and while there had written an 18-page outline on how to rob and kill elderly people so she could get rich. The document, which she had entitled Prison and After, Making Life Count, had been uncovered during a search of her cell. At her trial at the Old Bailey, Adeola tried to claim that the document was a crime novel she was writing and that she had an alibi on the day of the murder. Her DNA, she claimed, had got on Mrs. Mendel's hand when she had scratched it trying to help her cross the road the previous day. The jury preferred to believe the prosecution's assertion that the document was a blueprint for future crimes, and, on the 26th of June 2006, they found 18-year-old Adeola guilty. Adeola was sentenced to life imprisonment with the recommendation that she serve a minimum of 20 years. A millionaire's teenage daughter who wrote a murder manual before killing an elderly woman has been jailed for life. Kemi Adeola was 17 when she stabbed 84-year-old Anne Mendel 14 times during a burglary in March 2005 at her home in Golders Green, northwest London. "You are a remorseless and cold-blooded killer who is a danger to the public," said Judge Richard Hone. Setting a minimum sentence of 20 years in jail, the judge said Adeola might have gone on to kill again. Judge Hone said, "I think you actually wanted to experience what it felt like to kill someone in cold blood, possibly so you could write about it, but more probably so you could boast about it and possibly even do it again." The judge said he had had the opportunity to observe Adeola's performance during the trial. "You are intelligent, manipulative and skilled in deceit way beyond your years," he told her. The Old Bailey heard Adeola hatched a blueprint on how she would kill an elderly victim after robbing them. Mrs. Mendel, who was a former neighbor of Adeola, was found by her husband covered in coats in the hallway of their home. Soft target. Leonard Mendel, 81, told the court he tried to give his wife of 50 years the kiss of life when he returned from an errand to find the hall phone wires cut and blood on the walls. The prosecution said Adeola had chosen Mrs. Mendel as a soft target on which to practice before finding a rich, elderly and defenseless woman to kill for her money. Adeola, now 18, had written plans for the killing while serving a sentence for shoplifting. Her aim was to make £3 million. But she claimed that the 18-page neatly written murder manual found in a cell search at Bulwood Hall, Essex, was the draft of a crime thriller. Adeola, who disposed of her bloody clothing, might have got away with murder but for a tiny speck of DNA found on Mrs. Mendel's hand. Henry Blaxland QC, defending, said, "The court has before it somebody who is, on the face of it, emotionally damaged. She finds herself utterly alone in the world given that her family have entirely washed their hands of her." The teenager's father, Bola Adeola, who runs a property management company, said, "What she did was evil." A millionaire's daughter was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in jail on Wednesday after being found guilty of killing an elderly woman. What lay behind the killing of Anne Mendel? 18 pages of neatly hand-written notes found in Kemi Adeola's prison cell describe in graphic detail her murderous plan to get rich quick. Entitled, Prison and After, Making Life Count, the manual talks of finding a wealthy and elderly victim who she would rob and kill. She must be wealthy, quite elderly and defenseless, it said of the potential victim. She talked of finding a victim to rob and kill. This would involve staking out houses worth millions of pounds in isolated areas. The teenager said it was a work of fiction inspired by her fascination for crime writers James Patterson and Martina Cole. But an Old Bailey jury disagreed in favor of the prosecution's view that it was a blueprint for murder. They found the 18-year-old, of Camden, North London, guilty of murdering 84-year-old Anne Mendel at her home in Golders Green in northwest London. Grisly plan, Sir Alan Green, QC prosecuting, said the significance of the horror script was only appreciated when Adeola was linked to the brutal attack. We say there is written evidence that Kemi had earlier written out plans to murder an elderly woman and steal from that woman's home, he told the court. The prosecution said Adeola had chosen Mrs. Mendel as a soft target on which to practice before finding a rich, elderly and defenseless woman to kill for her money. It listed items required for her grisly plan, including guns, silencers, bulletproof vests, drugs, 2 sharp knives, a Jamie Oliver baby blue scooter and handcuffs. The victim would first be watched. Visit them disguised as an A-level student from a nearby school, said the notes. The victim would be attacked as she arrived home under the cover of darkness. Show the knife to her, then place it against her throat. The woman would be injected with a tranquilizer and quizzed about bank account pins and safe combinations. She would be forced to write a letter telling her husband she was leaving him for someone else. She would then be killed, her head and limbs cut off with a butcher's knife and put in cling film and black bags and dumped in bins. An alternative plan was to drive the victim to the top of a cliff, slit her throat, set fire to the car and send it over the edge. Defensive and arrogant, Adeola was quizzed by prison authorities who were concerned after finding the notes in her cell at Bulwood Hall in October 2004. Forensic psychologist Lydia Sears said, "There was concern what was behind it. She would not explain herself." But Adeola refused to be drawn on her book. Miss Sears said, "She was defensive, arrogant and assertive. She was asked, 'Is this something you are going to do?' She said, 'I want it back, it's a story.' I asked whether she had considered what the intention was before writing the book. She refused to answer. She left the room." A psychiatric report carried out after the discovery of the document said there was nothing to suggest she was capable of such violence. The psychiatric report did not predict any likely occurrence of this, said a spokesman for Barnet Youth Offending Team. Once her supervision was completed, there was no mechanism for stopping her re-offending. All that elderly Anne Mendel and multimillionaire's daughter Kemi Adeola shared was a brief spell as neighbours in a North London suburb. Grey-haired great-grandmother Mrs. Mendel, 7 stone and barely 4 feet 10 inches, had devoted her life to her family, charity and community, and despite her 84 years and increasing frailty would, say friends, travel miles to help people. Public schoolgirl Adeola cared only for herself. She had served time for shoplifting, boasted of working as a £500 a night prostitute and, most chillingly of all, written a blueprint for murder. Over 18 pages written while she was in a young offenders institution, she dreamed up a plan to make £3 million by killing a wealthy, quite elderly and defenseless victim. The dossier was found in her cell and a council monitoring team was set up to supervise her for 3 months after her release. But psychiatrists decided Adeola did not pose a risk and, a month after supervision expired, she struck. Adeola adhered to virtually every word of her manual, stabbing the Jewish pensioner 14 times at her home in Golders Green, North London. The victim was discovered by her 81-year-old husband Leonard, lying under a pile of clothes in her blood-soaked pajamas and pink dressing gown. Adeola, daughter of a property tycoon reputed to be worth £10 million, faces a life sentence when she is sentenced today after an Old Bailey jury found her guilty of the fiendish murder. After the verdict, sources close to the murder inquiry said the teenager was born to kill, a supremely arrogant psychopath with total disregard for humanity. Her father Bola Adeola has disowned her. "Nobody is born evil, but what she did was evil," he said. "She is no longer my daughter. I will never see her again, and don't want her anywhere near me. I regret the day I ever met her mother. When I saw Mrs. Mendel's picture I started crying. As a Christian, I can't believe anyone would do that." Mr. Adeola, 49, a former boxer who has remarried and lives in a £2 million Berkshire home, had briefly given his daughter a £140 a week job and free accommodation. "She was staying with me until a month before the murder, when I found out she had been shoplifting," he said. "I do wonder whether this woman would still be alive if I hadn't kicked her out. At first I couldn't accept that somebody with my blood in her veins could do this to anyone, but then I saw the evidence. She should rot in hell." The marriage of Mr. Adeola, who came here from Nigeria as a child, and Kemi's Barbados-born mother Mercuria, lasted barely 4 years, and he had little contact during the children's upbringing. The couple produced 3 children, and Mercuria has a 4th child from another relationship. Despite suggestions that Mrs. Adeola received a £4 million divorce settlement, she and her children led a shiftless life around the country, moving to a succession of homes in places including Cheltenham and Peterborough, frequently alienating neighbours. At one property in Gloucestershire, Adeola killed the goldfish in a neighbour's pond and blamed a cat. The teenage killer briefly boarded at £23,000 a year Wycliffe College. The independent school at Stonehouse in the Cotswolds prides itself on its academic and sporting achievements, but Adeola only lasted a few months because of a row over who was paying her fees. The dysfunctional family moved into Elmcroft Road in Golders Green for several months, living next door to Mr. and Mrs. Mendel. The elderly couple had been married for 50 years and lived a quiet, rewarding life. They had 2 children, and 14 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Their son Yitzhak, appealing for help after the murder, said, "My mother spent every day of her week performing good deeds and charity work. She devoted her whole life to visiting the sick, helping friends and neighbors, and bringing a smile to everyone she knew, even complete strangers." In earlier years, Mrs. Mendel had worked as a hospital secretary and joined the army during the Second World War to help track German bombers blitzing the East End of London where the couple lived. She offered the hand of friendship to the girl who was to kill her, letting the teenager into her house after she locked herself out. But neighbors said Adeola subjected residents to a reign of terror and racial harassment, abusing young children and even smearing excrement on windows. She was arrested for abusing one Asian neighbor. A resident, who did not want to be identified, said, "She gave a lot of trouble to one particular family. Once she lay in wait for the man, an Asian, behind a bush and punched him in the face, breaking his nose. She called his wife a packy lover. He said she tried to poison his dog as well." Other neighbors recall Mr. Adeola sometimes turning up in his Rolls Royce to see his children, but the visits were brief and infrequent. Criminal habits. Adeola ignored school and by the age of 15 had fallen into criminal habits, pilfering goods from high street stores. "It's a skill," she told the jury. explaining how she became expert at altering receipts to secure refunds for stolen goods. She was not as adept as she thought, however, and after a string of convictions found herself facing a custodial sentence. Her self-obsession continued, and she boasted to a sibling of her acting talents when being questioned by a youth worker. She told how she wept, mumbled and arched her back to convince the woman of her innocence and vulnerability, to try to limit her sentence. "It worked, such a treat, I could tell she was touched," she wrote. "I felt she sensed my anguish." Again, she overestimated her skill and ended up at Bulwood Hall Young Offenders Institute in Essex for 3 months. It was there that her thoughts and writings turned to murder. During a routine cell search, staff unearthed her blueprint, entitled Prison and After, Making Life Again. It included a shopping list of sharp knives or butcher's knives, guns, drugs and handcuffs, and logged in chilling detail plans to kill, dismember and dispose of a victim in pursuit of £3 million. She imagined stalking an elderly woman in a wealthy area, possibly posing as a schoolgirl carrying out a questionnaire for homework. "Run lightly and silently behind her and cover her mouth with a gloved hand," she wrote. "Make her so scared she cooperates. Keep calm, composed and silent. She must cooperate or take a knife to her throat. Tell her, this is your only warning." She described building a cling film tent and wrote graphically about disposing of the body. "With your butcher's knife, remove her head. Wrap it in film to contain bleeding, detach limbs one by one." When confronted by psychiatrists and prison staff, Adeola insisted her notes were part of the draft for a novel. Barnet Youth Offending Team said yesterday a psychiatric assessment carried out after the document was discovered did not indicate any concern that Miss Adeola would be predisposed in any way to this type of violence, nor was there any evidence of this type of violence in her past. The report described her as a highly intelligent and sophisticated young person who, with good support, should make a good recovery and engage in her A-level studies. A prison psychiatrist, who believed Adeola's lies that she had achieved 4 GCSE grades, said it was a shame she had been jailed. After her release in November 2004, education was the last thing on Adeola's mind. She moved into an £800 a month Hampstead flat with another teenager, telling the court she paid the rent by working as a £500 a night escort. "It is a completely legitimate and professional business. We earned up to £5,000 a week," she said. In March 2005, with her supervision at an end, Adeola turned her novel into horrific reality. In the hour that Mr. Mendel popped out to pick up air tickets for a trip to Israel, the teenager struck, inflicting deep wounds to her victim's torso, right arm and back with a blade at least 1 inch wide and 5 inches long. A spokesman for the Barnet Youth Offending Team said, "There was nothing in the file that would have predicted homicide." The psychiatric report did not predict any likely occurrence of this. During her trial, Adeola, dressed in pinstriped suit, pink trainers and spangly belt, appeared unmoved by the gravity of her crime, smiling and exchanging text messages during court recesses. She had lied brazenly to police over DNA found on her victim, claiming she had visited Golders Green the day before the murder and the pensioner had scratched her hand as she helped her across the road. With the assistance of a 16-year-old girl, who cannot be named for legal reasons, she then tried to construct an alibi. Detective Chief Inspector Steve Morris called her a callous and devious young woman, adding, "Her cold, calculated use of extreme violence beggars belief." Police believe more victims may have been in the pipeline and that the attack on Mrs. Mendel may have been a dry run for a wealthier target. Detective Sergeant Paul Belsham said, "If she had got away with this, then God knows what she might have done. She is very, very dangerous." Mr. Mendel, who has moved to Israel to live with his daughter, described his wife as someone whose life was taken up with kindness and giving up of herself to others. The unjust end she met, having so much taken away in such an undeserving manner, left us in total shock. Adeola pleaded not guilty, but the prosecution argued successfully that she had carried out the murder herself, possibly as a dry run for the slaughter of a wealthy woman who would make a more lucrative job. It was a killing the teenager had meticulously planned in a murder manual written a few months earlier when she was in juvenile custody. Staff at the Bullwood Hall Juvenile Offenders Institution, where Adeola was serving a sentence for shoplifting, found the blueprint in October 2004, during an inspection of her cell. On being confronted, the teenager claimed the whole thing was fiction. But within the space of a few months, the fiction turned into reality. The handwritten notes, entitled "Prison and After," making life count, began innocently, with plans to lose 2 stones from 11 stone 8 to 9.5 stone, and locate 2-bed apartment. Adeola, herself the daughter of a millionaire property developer, went on to outline how she would obtain bank accounts, make £2,000 to furnish her apartment, buy a Mercedes and clothes and DVDs. Despite having been privately educated, Adeola left school with no qualifications, and wanted to obtain fake GCSE and A-level qualifications over the internet, and mock up a CV stating she had attended the Chelmsford School for Girls. But the main changes for a happy future depended on Adeola getting a minimum of £3 million, according to the Journal. For this she would need to rob and murder an elderly woman, and frame the woman's husband for the killing. Such a feat would require equipment, petrol canisters, plastic bags, cling film, semi-automatic guns, taser stun guns and a bulletproof vest were all duly listed. So were various disguises, wigs, dark glasses, and bizarrely, a full-body fat suit, approximately 18-stone woman. She sketched out her ideal victim. She must be wealthy, quite elderly and defenseless. Find a candidate and watch her. Their routine must be closely observed. Follow her. She will probably be married. See if they get any visitors. Create a survey questionnaire and visit them disguised as an A-level student. Tell them it's field work. Ask them, do you have guns to protect yourself? The attack was imagined in emotionless detail. Lie in wait for the victim, creep up on her, and cover her mouth with a gloved hand. Once in the house, threaten the victim with a knife, extract bank account details and the code to her safe, get her to write a fake "I'm leaving" note, and then dispatch her. With your butcher's knife remove her head. Wrap it in film to contain bleeding, detach limbs one by one, she wrote. When you have completed the task, put head, body pieces in black bag. The job was to be done by February 2005. Throughout her trial, Adeola insisted the document was a work of fiction, notes for a crime thriller she was writing in the style of a James Patterson book. Following the discovery of the papers in her cell, she was interviewed by a senior staff member and psychologist, whom she told, "I want them back. It's a story." In court she dismissed the manual as the scribblings of a 16-year-old girl. She said she was fascinated by writers such as Martina Cole and James Patterson, and wanted to emulate them. "I had always considered writing a book. I'd like to be an author. When I was in Bullwood Hall I thought it would be a good place to start," she told the court. In her evidence, the teenager also told how she had set up house with another girl in Belsize Park, North London, and worked as an escort to pay the rent. All we had to do was go out on a date and we could make £500 a night. We could make up to £5,000 a week, she said. It was safe because we shadowed each other and it was easy. A police source described finding a cache of sex toys when Adeola's flat was raided after she was arrested. There were several vibrators, nipple clamps, lesbian pornographic magazines, edible underwear made of candy, revealing outfits, handcuffs, all sorts of equipment, the source said. Police also discovered piles of stolen designer clothes and a book entitled Great Crimes. Adeola also told the court she had begun stealing from shops at age 15, something she described as a skill. She earned a string of convictions for theft, which culminated in her serving 3 months in a young offenders institution, where she hatched her murder plans. The young woman was also charged with 2 counts of perverting the course of justice, after she was taped setting up a bogus alibi for the murder with a 16-year-old accomplice. She and the 16-year-old, who cannot be named for legal reasons, were convicted on one of those counts. Speaking after the verdict, Detective Inspector Steve Morris of the Metropolitan Police described the case as a wicked, premeditated murder committed by a callous, devious young woman, and her cold, calculated use of extreme violence beggars belief. Her father, Bola Adeola, who runs a successful property management company, said, "What she did was evil." Presiding Judge Richard Hone QC suggested she may have even committed the murder to amass material for her future literary endeavors. Adeola was remanded in custody to await sentencing next month. A life of privilege. Kemi Adeola is the daughter of Bola Adeola, a property manager and former boxer who is worth an estimated £10 million. He said yesterday that his daughter was a spoilt, cunning girl who had been obsessed with money from an early age. He lost contact with her when she was 11. After that, he said, he passed money and messages to her through her grandparents. Following her release from Bulwood Hall prison, he set her up in a flat, but they fell out when he advised her to go straight. According to Mr. Adeola, she responded by vandalizing his office. Despite the discovery of the blueprint for murder, psychologists at Bulwood Hall had held high hopes for Adeola on her release, describing her as an articulate, intelligent and sophisticated girl.